Hello, you're listening to Born Optimistic, and with me this week is the wonderful singer-songwriter and composer, Gabriel Kahane. Gabriel, as regular listeners will know, but may come as a surprise to you, our first question is always, where do you sit on the optimism spectrum?
Well, I think as far as the American political landscape is concerned, I feel both a great sense of terror and also a great deal of optimism. I think that the one is maybe not possible without the other. Otherwise, one ends up being Pollyanna-ish.
Would you say that the American political atmosphere is the defining factor in your life? I mean, aside from that, how would you define yourself?
No, I would say more so that the health of the planet and I mean I guess in a sense the United States' role in setting a course for real action on climate change, it has such global implications, and for the moment our current political landscape is such that real action feels totally impossible. And as a new father of a daughter who's 8.5 months old, I think daily about the world that she's going to inherit, and about the fact that we are in the midst of climate catastrophe. That being said, there is a tremendous amount of energy, I think, on the progressive side in the United States, and I think that depending on what happens in 2020, if we're able to harness that energy to electoral change and then legislative change. Um, there's a wonderful writer, Dave Wallace Wells, who is actually a college classmate of mine, who's just published a book called The Uninhabitable Earth, which is sort of a treatise on climate change, climate disaster. And I think he takes the position that there is reason for optimism, even as we're facing um, tremendous challenges.
And how does the fact that you feel there's an impending climate apocalypse, how does that affect your daily life? How does that affect how you roll day to day?
Well, I think that's changing from day to day. I think shortly after the election of Donald Trump, um, a lot of people in my community began to try to take personal responsibility, say, for uh, the way that they consume, their carbon footprint, and so on and so forth. But interestingly, I feel in the last 3 to 6 months, there have been a number of interesting essays that I've read, sort of making the argument that um, conscious consumption, in a sense, is a cop out for change at the legislative level, and that eating fewer hamburgers and buying carbon offsets for plane tickets is wonderful, but we all have limited amounts of energy, and to the extent that that's the case, it's maybe more useful for us to put our energy into really pushing for legislative change. But I think I think I've become much more cognizant, both with respect to climate, but also economic and racial justice, in just interrogating my actions and my choices, and trying to make sure that they're pointing in the right direction from an ethical standpoint.
There's a fundamental paradox, I think, at the core of your work, in that I first came across you because of that Empire Liquor Mart, that YouTube video with the orchestra in an apartment. And, you've made this really, really incredibly beautiful piece of music about an incredibly tragic event.
What I would say about that is that in this country, where it seems that every few weeks we have a new story about um, a black kid or a young black man who has been killed, often by a police officer, and then does not receive justice. And not only does not receive justice, um, but is often put on trial in the afterlife. So we have these scenarios where, you hear things, about Michael Brown. Oh, he was no angel, or trying, the media trying to dig up dirt on these kids who have been killed in an attempt to sort of justify the fact that they have been cut down so early in life. And I think part of what I was after in writing Empire Liquor Mart was to celebrate the innocence and the childhood of Latasha Harlins, about whom the song is written, and to really kind of push back against this idea that it's acceptable to demonize someone who's been murdered, rather than to look at the person who's done the shooting. And the other thing I would say, as I was trying to find a place for this story, this is, for your listeners who are unfamiliar, this is part of an album called The Ambassador, which is an exploration of Los Angeles through its built architecture. And there's a street address for each of 10 songs, and each of the songs looks into the lives that inhabit these buildings, sometimes fictional, sometimes historical, and so on and so forth. And there was an English professor at a university where I'd been doing some work who tipped me off to a new book that had been written about the death of Latasha Harlins. And as I was, reading the story of her death in conjunction with a lot of literature about Los Angeles and how we see Los Angeles, I also came to read an essay, I think maybe it was by the French philosopher Baudrillard, who said Los Angeles is best viewed at night from a jet landing at LAX. And then elsewhere, I read something about how during the uprising following the Rodney King verdict in 1992, that you could see both the incredible lights of the LA basin and then all of the fires from the looting that was happening all over town. And as I began thinking about Latasha Harlins and her death and searching for some kind of solace, I imagined her rising up to the heavens and looking down on Los Angeles and beholding this incredible sight, this sort of beautiful terror of the lights of Los Angeles, and these fires. And so that's where this lyric, two kinds of light from fires and fixtures, that sort of came from a lot of different readings that I was doing. And then the other thing for me about that song was this odd connection to the Kennedy family, because the title song on that record, Ambassador Hotel, is in a way an elegy for Robert Kennedy, who was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in June of 1968, just after having won the Democratic primary in California. And there's something about the Kennedy family and their sort of almost gravitational, magnetic propensity toward tragedy between Chappaquiddick and, of course, JFK being assassinated in 1963, and then Bobby Kennedy in 1968. And there's this Robert Lowell poem that's in his 1968 notebook where he says, "Doom was woven on his shirt." And there's something about the propensity for tragedy in the Kennedy family, which had everything, this incredibly well-to-do family, Boston Brahmin family. And then the Harlins family, as I read about Latasha and her family and discovering that her mother had been killed, her uncle had been killed on the same day when she was, I think, 5 years old. And trying to link these two families, one of which, was part of the Great Migration, fleeing Jim Crow, moving to Los Angeles, seeking a better life, and yet being hit with tragedy upon tragedy. And so there was some kind of psychic link between these two families that otherwise have nothing in common that I think drew me to telling that story.
Going way, way back to your childhood, was there a time when you became particularly aware and anxious then as a result of that of the state of America? Or is this just a recent thing that happened with the dawn of parenthood?
I think that my political conscience developed probably when I was at university. I was a junior in college in the run up to the war in Iraq, and I would, get on the bus with various um, activists and go to New York for protests. But I also felt a certain kind of ambivalence about the protest movement as a college student, and I was active in um, campaigning for John Kerry in 2004, and then I think with the election of Obama in 2008, like a lot of well-meaning progressives, I think even though on some level we knew that his election did not in any way spell the end of racism or prove that we had entered into some kind of post-racial bliss. Um, Nevertheless, I think many of us let our guards down, and we let our guard down in part because of his incredible charisma and his incredible oratory. But I think when we look back on his presidency, and in particular the fact that the financial industry was in no way held to account for the grave, um, you know, irresponsible decisions that were made with respect to toxic mortgages and so on and so forth. Um, of course, there are aspects of his presidency that were out of his hand. He was facing a Congress that I think was in many ways fundamentally against him because he was a black man, and Mitch McConnell said very explicitly that his number one goal was to make sure that Obama was a one-term president, and so there, his hands were certainly tied, and yet his presidency was a continuation of a lot of neoliberal policies, and by that I mean specifically this belief that that markets can solve things, and this notion that we can stand for equality on the one hand and free markets on the other. And I think what we're learning over the course of the Trump presidency is that neoliberalism really doesn't work. That neoliberalism is really a sort of polite word for hardcore libertarianism, wherein you can't really have racial justice and social justice unless markets are better regulated. And I think that to your question of where did that awakening occur, I think it happened sort of over the course of the Obama presidency. In certain ways, it happened earlier. During toward the end of Bush's second term, I was beginning work on a music theater piece called February House, which tells the story of a number of artists living in a rooming house in Brooklyn, among them W.H. Auden, Benjamin Britten, Peter Pears, Gypsy Rose Lee, Jane and Paul Bowles, trying to, this experiment in communal living. And at its heart was this question of how would W.H. Auden, who in a way was the Bob Dylan of his day, how would he respond to creeping fascism? And he had become really disenchanted with the left during the Spanish Civil War, where he had seen incredible violence, atrocities perpetrated by the left, and he ended up being relatively passive during the Second World War. And for me, there was this parallel, as a young man in my mid-20s, of what is the role of an artist during a war. And this was a moment when a lot of movie stars were, on television all the time, speaking out against the war, but not necessarily doing it in a particularly sophisticated way. And so I guess I would trace my political conscience to to the Bush presidency in some sense.
Prior to then, so in your teens and preteens, did you live in this blissfully happy state of ignorance where everything was fantastic? Were you just a happy-go-lucky kid?
I wouldn't say that I was exactly happy-go-lucky. My father is a concert pianist and conductor, and he's also kind of student for life, citizen of the world. And when I was growing up, he often would sort of wear the weight of the world on his shoulders. And I think I was aware of how much things like, the conflict in Israel Palestine, how much that grieved him, as a progressive Jew, descended. His mother was a Holocaust survivor, which I write about a little bit in Book of Travelers in the song Port of Hamburg. But he, of course, things have gotten much worse since the times that I remember in the late 1990s. But I think I remember on some intuitive level, even before I kind of understood it intellectually, I got that there was a connection between the political landscape and what artists could do. As far as what growing up, I would describe myself as a little bit of a late bloomer. I have a lot of friends who are colleagues now who knew what they were going to do when they were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. When I was a kid, I was playing in chess tournaments. I was a very serious chess player. I was acting in plays and in operas. I played the piano, but not particularly seriously. I think happy-go-lucky sounds a little bit too. I don't know that is an accurate description of what I was like as a kid, but neither would I say that I was particularly directed. I think it really wasn't until my mid-20s that I had the inklings of what I wanted to do with my life, and I think I would say even really more recently, the last 4 or 5 years, there has become a greater clarity as far as the kind of marriage of music and social practice, storytelling and social practice.
And do you think that because your dad was in the business, or certainly adjacent career-wise to what you were doing, that slowed you down in terms of embracing it, that you were perhaps rebelling against him?
It's a good question. It's a good question for a psychologist. My mother is a psychologist, and I think she actually. I will get to that question, but I think it bears mentioning that for me, this album, Book of Travelers, feels like it really bears her influence. In as much as I couldn't have made this album without having had the 90 or 100 conversations over the course of the 2 weeks that I was on the train. And she has a kind of preternatural ability to get people talking very openly and with great vulnerability. And I feel like I have just a dash of that ability from her. But as far as the question of whether my father slowed me down, I mean, certainly the shadow of his artistry and his musicianship was a part of my childhood and my adolescence, but in no way did he lord it over me. I mean, he is an incredibly gentle, generous person, and I think he is thrilled beyond belief at the career that I've sort of carved out for myself, and he and I now have the opportunity to work together a couple times a year. He and my mom, who met when they were 10 years old, actually, they played in a number of folk rock bands together in their teens. They weren't together romantically straight through, but they did play in a couple folk rock bands. And when my father was a teenager, he was really torn between playing folk music and playing classical music, and ultimately decided to go to conservatory and become a classical pianist.
There you are, in many ways, combining both.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that in many senses, I am very much my my parents' offspring, both in the sense of forming this union of an interest in Western classical music and folk music, but also the kind of interpersonal psychological realm from my mother.
And what do you think your parents tried to instill in you in terms of your duty as a human?
I would say that whatever they instilled in me, I think they did largely by example. Um, I don't remember there being, um, lectures about this is how we do X, this is how we do Y. I think my parents are both incredibly kind and generous people. My father is very introverted. My mom is very extroverted. Um, but they they're both, I think, extremely ethical. I think they also encouraged me to be curious. I think curiosity is something that was passed down to me by my parents, and I think curiosity is really central to the kind of work that I do, because I use music as the language to express what I do, but it's rooted in a lot of research, and it's rooted in reaching outside of my own experience into other experiences, whether they be contemporary or historical. And I think that drive toward curiosity comes pretty centrally from my parents.
And I suppose example is the only way or the best way we can really teach our children. But you definitely seem to have a really strong sense of it's not okay to do nothing. It's not okay to let what's going on in the world just pass you by and wash over you.
Yes, absolutely. I think you may be familiar with the walkway metaphor of social justice. But if you imagine that there's a moving walkway, and if you're just standing on it, you're reinforcing the status quo. I think there was a certain moment where I realized that even though I am still a relatively obscure musician, I have some platform, and I have some thousands of fans who pay attention to what I do. And I think that with so much injustice in so many realms, festering nationally and internationally, locally and globally. I guess ultimately for me it comes down to empathy, because as I was talking about earlier, I feel like empathy is this primary currency of storytelling, but it's also a primary currency of how societies either function well or don't function well. Um, and and so I think what I've been trying to focus on, rather than making you know pieces that feel like ideological screed or ideological polemic, is to really focus on the human. And if I can, I would even say, if I can even emotionally manipulate people to feel empathy for a subject, and by subject I mean an individual they thought they had nothing in common with, um, then I feel like maybe I can transmit um, some of that uh, some of that generosity of spirit to other people in the world, and maybe slightly transform the way that they see their community, the way they see their city, their country, what have you.
And what particular actions are you trying to nudge people towards? Like, is it just that idea of community, of empathy, of taking ownership of the world around them? Or are there more specific actions you'd like people to take?
Well, I think it depends from project to project. I think with Book of Travelers, which is the album about my train trip in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential election in the States, even though I never talk about the internet, for me that album is really an indictment of the digital space. But it does it, I would argue, in a positive way by proposing what can transpire when we step out of the digital space and into an analog space where there are new social connections forged that require us not to be digitally sorted as opposed to sorted. And I think that so many of the experiences that I had while riding the train those 2 weeks simply would have been impossible given the sort of individual and algorithmic ways in which we end up getting put in different buckets or boxes or silos on the internet. And I think that, again, one of the things that I'm sort of implicitly trying to raise awareness for through that album is this idea that there are several industries and power structures that benefit from our division. And this is something that I think we're seeing not just in the United States, but in European democracies as well, where you have this sort of kind of ethno-populist movement, but that at the heart of it, for hundreds of years, it has been the case that those in power consolidate their power by making sure that there is no solidarity among working people. And of course, in the United States, that has manifested in those in power sowing the seeds of racial animus anytime there's a threat of solidarity between working white people and working black people. And that tragic cycle you see happen over and over and over again. Sometimes you see it on the national level, sometimes you see it within a small community. And I think that it's one of the things that I think makes the discourse around identity politics really fraught. On the one hand, I really, really deeply and passionately believe that we have to make sure that the voiceless are given space to speak and to make their grievances known, and to make sure that the platforms that they have to make those grievances known are really robust. And on the other hand, I think that when those discourses are handled clumsily, we can end up separating our coalition. And I think this is something that Dr. King wrote about and spoke about so eloquently. This idea that they want to divide us at the level of poor white people and poor black people, and that in order to create a coalition, we have to look beyond that. Of course, it's very easy to oversimplify and say, oh, if we have economic justice, we'll have racial justice. It's not that simple. That the two things have to be pursued in tandem.
There's a growing awareness that we need more equality and fairness in the world, and I don't think the normal person isn't going to say that's a bad idea. I think the difficult thing for most people is figuring out how to get there. And
right.
your journey, switching yourself off from the internet, not taking a phone, taking this journey that resulted in the album, is almost like a metaphor, a metaphoric pilgrimage. But what can we do in our daily lives as a result of being inspired by your journey?
We have these industries that profit from our division and from the amplification of division. And one of the things that was most striking to me about this trip was that while there are still really serious differences, cultural, political, what have you, to work out, when I sat across from strangers on the train, literally breaking bread, I found that I was drawn to the humanity of the people I was with, drawn to the stories of their family. One thing that I observed months after finishing the album was that it's an album about family. Almost all the songs are about family and the sacrifices that we make for family. And I think that's something that feels universal throughout the world. And yet we're constantly being told that our differences are irreconcilable. And so I think that as far as what we can do in our daily lives, I think, and these are not original thoughts, but certainly getting off of social media. I think listening more than talking. I think carving out the space to be meditative. I mean, I think another benefit of getting off of social media is not just that social media amplifies difference and amplifies polarization, but also that it prevents us from being contemplative. And I think that if we don't have the space to be contemplative, we don't have the space to be empathetic. If we're constantly taking in information, we can't be empathetic. So I think that there's great value in turning off our devices and meditating and reading. I think that we're increasingly becoming a society that doesn't read. And I think that for me, as someone who's really passionate about reading, I find that the kind of daydreaming that I do when I read is something that really activates my sort of empathetic and imaginative capabilities. And I think there's value there as well.
Well, in a way as well, that to bring this all full circle from offline to online and back to offline in real life, Tuesday, April the 9th, we've all got the amazing opportunity to gather together in a room in your honour as you play the National Concert Hall studio space in Dublin. And I don't want you to give too much away about what people should expect. We'll preserve some mystery, but hopefully this will help as a rallying call to gather people together, because I, for one, can't wait to see your show. Your music is just so beautiful. There's so many amazing emotions that it stirs.
Well, thank you so much. I've never been to Ireland. I'm so excited to finally be making my debut in Dublin, and I'll be singing songs from Book of Travelers, and also from The Ambassador. I'll do a few newer things. Lest people think that I'm some kind of reactionary Luddite who thinks that we should all go back to living by candlelight. I've been writing mini songs for an ongoing series called Twitter Christ, or Twitter Cycle, where I've been taking often ridiculous Twitter messages, Twitter posts, and setting them to music. And I'll probably do a little set of those as well.
Well, I can't wait. That's Tuesday, April 9th, the NCH studio. Gabriel, thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing getting to hear the inspiration behind your amazing songs. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And everybody, you've been listening to Born Optimistic. Until next week, thank you so much for listening.